Hi, welcome back. Today I want to walk you through a story that sounds almost too strange to be true, but it raises some very real questions about money, ownership, and what you would actually do if you stumbled onto a fortune while just trying to do your job. Picture this. An 18-year-old construction worker in a small town in Belgium is doing exactly what he does every day, breaking up old concrete and clearing out the basement of a building that used to be a brewery decades ago. The place has been empty for years. Dust everywhere, old pipes, broken bottles, the usual mess you find in a building nobody has touched in a long time. He is running a jackhammer through a thick section of the floor when the concrete gives way, and underneath it, wrapped in old cloth and packed into rusted metal boxes, he finds bars and coins made of gold. Not a handful, not a small stash. When everything was later counted and valued, the total came out to around $10.4 million. Now think about that for a second. This is a teenager, still early in his career, holding a tool that costs maybe a few $100s, and in the span of one afternoon, he goes from breaking concrete to breaking news. I want to slow down here because the discovery itself is only half the story. The other half, and honestly the more important half, if you actually care about how money and law work, is the question that comes right after the excitement fades. Who actually gets to keep it? Because finding something valuable does not automatically make it yours, and that surprises a lot of people. We grow up hearing phrases like finders keepers, but real property law almost never works that way, especially when the discovery involves buried treasure, historical artifacts, or anything with unclear origins. This is exactly why this story is worth understanding, even if you never plan to swing a jackhammer through a basement floor. It touches on ownership rights, inheritance law, historical property claims, and how governments treat sudden wealth. Those are things that quietly affect regular people every single day, whether it is an inheritance dispute, a surprise windfall, or even just understanding what happens if you find something valuable on land you do not fully own. Let's break this down step by step, starting with the basics of who typically has a claim in a situation like this. In most European countries, including Belgium, the law generally recognizes a few different parties who might have a stake in a treasure discovery. First, there is the person who physically finds it, in this case, the young worker. Second, there is the owner of the property where it was found, which in this case would be whoever owns that old brewery building. Third, and this is the part people often forget, there can be a previous owner or their descendants, someone who may have hidden the gold generations ago and whose family could still have a legitimate historical claim. And fourth, depending on the country, the government itself can have a right to a portion of significant historical finds, especially if the items are considered part of national heritage. Here's what this means in practical terms. Belgian law, like many countries with a civil law tradition, often splits ownership of a treasure find between the finder and the landowner, assuming no rightful heir comes forward. That sounds simple enough, but in a case like this, simple is rarely how it plays out. Because now you have to ask, who built this brewery, who owned it before it closed, and did that family know what was sitting under their own floor? Old breweries in Belgium have a long history, some going back over a century, and many changed hands multiple times through sales, inheritance, and even wartime disruption. Gold hidden in a basement is not exactly a random event. People do not usually bury metal boxes full of gold coins for no reason. Historically, this kind of hidden wealth often connects to periods of instability, wars, currency collapses, or families trying to protect their savings from being seized, taxed, or devalued. Now, this is important because it helps explain why someone would go through the trouble of hiding gold instead of just keeping it in a bank. Think about it this way. Gold does not rely on a banking system to hold its value. It does not care about currency printing, interest rates, or a government freezing accounts during a crisis. For a family living through economic chaos, war, or occupation, Burying gold under a concrete floor was not paranoia, it was a practical decision. It meant that no matter what happened above ground, there was something solid waiting below it. That mindset is not some ancient relic of history either. It is the same basic reasoning that still drives a lot of interest in physical gold today, just without the concrete and the jackhammer. So back to the main question, who actually keeps the $10.4 million? In situations like this, Belgian authorities typically get involved almost immediately, both to verify the historical authenticity of the gold and to check whether any records exist tying it to a previous owner or family. This process can take months, sometimes longer, because gold bars and coins often carry stamps, mint marks, or serial numbers that can be traced. If investigators are able to identify a legitimate historical owner or their direct descendants, that family may have a strong legal claim to some or all of the gold, even after all these decades. If no such claim can be proven, the property owner and the person who found it often end up splitting the value according to whatever framework Belgian property law applies in that specific region, since laws can vary slightly, even within the same country. And here is where it gets even more interesting. Even after ownership is settled, there is still the matter of taxes. A sudden windfall like this is generally treated as taxable income or subject to specific windfall regulations, depending on how it is classified. So the number you hear in the headlines, $10.4 million, is very rarely the number that actually lands in anyone's pocket. Between legal fees, historical verification costs, potential inheritance claims, and taxation, the final amount received by the construction worker, if he is entitled to any share at all, could look very different from the headline figure. This is a pattern you see again and again with sudden wealth stories, whether it is a lottery win, an inheritance, or a discovery like this one. The gross number grabs attention, but the net number is what actually matters to the person living it. Before we go further, if you are finding this kind of story interesting, it would really help the channel if you hit like and consider subscribing. I break down stories like this regularly, connecting real-world events to the bigger picture of how money, gold, and financial systems actually work, and I would love to have you along for more of these. Now, let's talk about the historical mystery side of this, because that is honestly the part that keeps people hooked. Nobody knows for certain, at least publicly, exactly who hid this gold or why they never came back for it. There are a few reasonable possibilities worth thinking through. One is that the original owner passed away without ever telling anyone else where the gold was hidden, which happens more often than you would think, especially with older generations who grew up distrusting banks and formal financial systems. Another possibility is that the family who hid it was forced to flee during a period of conflict and simply never had the chance to return. Belgium's history in the 20th century includes occupation and displacement, and it is not unheard of for families to hide valuables before leaving, intending to come back later, only for circumstances to make that impossible. A third possibility, less dramatic but still plausible, is that ownership of the brewery changed hands so many times over the decades that whatever records existed about the hidden gold were simply lost, misplaced, or never passed down properly. Think about it this way. Every old building has layers of history stacked on top of each other, like rings on a tree. Owners change, purposes change, walls get rebuilt, floors get repoured. Somewhere in those layers, this particular secret got buried, literally and figuratively, and stayed hidden until a jackhammer accidentally broke through decades of silence. That is part of what makes stories like this so captivating. It is not just about the money. It is about a piece of the past suddenly forcing its way into the present, with no warning and no explanation attached. Now, I do want to be fair here and acknowledge some healthy skepticism, because stories involving huge sums of gold discovered by chance always attract a mix of genuine excitement and understandable doubt. Some people question the exact valuation since gold prices fluctuate, and initial estimates reported in the early stages of a story are not always the final, verified number. Others point out that legal processes involving historical discoveries can be slow and complicated, meaning the full resolution, including who ultimately receives what, might not be publicly confirmed for a long time after the initial headlines fade. That is a fair point, and it is worth remembering any time you see a dramatic dollar figure attached to a treasure story. The initial number often grabs headlines, but the confirmed final outcome usually takes much longer to settle and rarely gets the same level of attention once the excitement dies down. Here is a simple mental framework that can help you make sense of stories like this whenever they come up. And honestly, they do come up more often than people realize. Whenever you hear about a sudden discovery of hidden wealth, ask yourself 3 questions. First, who has a legal claim based on where it was found? Second, is there any traceable history connecting it to a previous owner or family? And third, what portion, if any, will actually end up with the person who physically found it after taxes, legal costs, and any competing claims are resolved? If you run any treasure story through those 3 questions, you will usually get a much more realistic picture than the headline alone gives you. Let's zoom out for a moment and connect this to something bigger, because this story is not really just about one lucky construction worker in Belgium. It is a reminder of something a lot of people forget in a world dominated by digital numbers on a screen. Physical gold still exists. It still gets buried, hidden, forgotten, and occasionally rediscovered, sometimes generations later. That is very different from a bank balance or a stock portfolio, which cannot really be hidden under a floor and forgotten about for 50 years. Gold has this unusual quality of surviving human forgetfulness. Currencies can be reissued, companies can dissolve, digital accounts can be lost to outdated passwords, but a gold bar buried in concrete just waits patiently, worth something the entire time, regardless of who remembers it exists. Looking ahead, stories like this one may become slightly less common as construction techniques, digging equipment, and even ground-penetrating scanning tools become more advanced and more widely used before any demolition or renovation work begins. In some cases now, older buildings are surveyed more carefully before workers start breaking through floors and walls, partly for safety reasons and partly because property developers have become more aware that unexpected discoveries can complicate a project both legally and financially. That does not mean discoveries like this will stop entirely, but it does suggest that pure accidental finds by hand tools may slowly become rarer as the construction industry adopts more careful pre-demolition inspection. So, what does any of this actually mean for you sitting at home watching this video, probably not planning on demolishing an old brewery anytime soon? Here's what this means on a more personal level. Stories like this are a good reminder that value can sit quietly, unnoticed, for a very long time. Whether that is gold under a floor or, more realistically for most of us, an old investment account we forgot about, a piece of family property with unclear ownership, or even just underappreciated assets sitting in a portfolio we have not reviewed in years. The lesson is not that everyone should start swinging a jackhammer through their basement. The lesson is that clarity around ownership, paperwork, and legal claims matters, whether we are talking about $10 million in gold or $10,000 in a forgotten account somewhere. Knowing what you own, where records exist, and who has a legitimate claim to something can save enormous amounts of stress, time, and money down the road for you and for the people who come after you. To bring this all together, an 18-year-old construction worker in Belgium went from an ordinary workday to the center of a $10.4 million mystery, all because a jackhammer broke through a section of concrete that had been quietly guarding a secret for who knows how long. The legal outcome is still working its way through Belgian property law, weighing the rights of the finder, the landowner, any possible historical heirs, and the government's interest in significant historical finds. The historical mystery behind who hid the gold and why they never returned for it may never be fully solved, and honestly, that unanswered part is part of what makes the story stick with people. What this really leaves us with is a pretty grounded reminder. Wealth does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly for decades, waiting, and sometimes the people who eventually find it are not the ones anyone would expect. If you found this breakdown helpful, stick around, because I cover stories exactly like this one regularly, connecting real events to the bigger picture of money, gold, and how financial systems really work. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.